Hello everyone and welcome to my channel Y&R Trends. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The courtroom was unnaturally silent, the kind of suffocating stillness that pressed down on Nikki Newman's chest and made every breath feel like an act of defiance against fate itself, as if the walls of Genoa City's courthouse were closing in on her, whispering echoes of every secret she had buried. Every lie she had told herself was necessary to protect her family, and every sacrifice she believed would one day be forgiven. Yet as she sat there gripping the edge of the polished wooden table, with trembling fingers, her eyes darting instinctively toward Victor before snapping back to the judge, she realized with terrifying clarity that forgiveness was not on trial here. Truth was, and truth, once unleashed, showed no mercy. The judge adjusted his glasses slowly, deliberately, as though savoring the weight of what he was about to reveal, his measured calm contrasting sharply with the storm raging inside Nikki, whose heart pounded so loudly she was certain everyone in the room could hear it. And as he began to speak, his voice steady and authoritative, he announced that the court had completed a full review of the submitted evidence, including financial records, private correspondence, sworn testimonies, and most damning of all, newly authenticated documents that had only recently come to light, documents that Nikki had prayed would never surface. And with each word, her composure fractured further, memories flooding her mind in jagged fragments. Hushed conversations in the Newman mansion, late-night decisions made in desperation, moments when she believed she was choosing the lesser evil for the sake of Victor, for their children, for the Newman legacy. Yet now those justifications rang hollow as the judge detailed how the evidence painted a picture not of loyalty but of manipulation, not of protection but of concealment. And as murmurs rippled through the courtroom, Nikki felt her world tilting, her gaze drifting to Victor once more, searching his face for reassurance, for anger, for anything, but his expression was unreadable, a carefully constructed mask that only deepened her dread, because Victor Newman was a man who could survive betrayal, but he never forgot it, and Nikki knew that whatever the judge revealed next would not only determine the court's ruling but would irrevocably alter her marriage, her standing, and her identity. The judge paused, allowing the tension to stretch painfully thin, before introducing the most explosive piece of evidence, a sworn affidavit corroborated by forensic accounting and digital timestamps, proving that Nikki had knowingly authorized transactions and decisions that directly contradicted her prior testimony, actions that shifted control, assets, and influence in ways that could no longer be dismissed as misunderstanding or coincidence. And the moment those words landed, Nikki's breath caught, a sharp gasp escaping her before she could stop it, her face draining of color as the reality of exposure hit her like a physical blow, because this was not just about money or power, it was about intent, and intent was something she could no longer explain away with emotional pleas or appeals to love. The judge continued, outlining how the evidence demonstrated a consistent pattern, one that suggested Nikki had deliberately withheld critical information not only from the court but from Victor himself, and at that, Victor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a subtle reaction that sent a chill down Nikki's spine because she knew that look. She had seen it before in boardrooms and war rooms, moments before Victor struck back harder than anyone anticipated. And as the judge elaborated, the room seemed to spin, Nikki's thoughts racing as she wondered who had betrayed her, who had uncovered the truth, whether it was Jack Abbott, whose rivalry with Victor was legendary and whose sense of justice was complicated by personal vendettas, or perhaps someone closer, someone she had trusted implicitly, because in Genoa City, betrayal rarely came from strangers. When the judge finally reached the conclusion of the evidentiary presentation, he folded his hands and delivered the words Nikki feared most, stating that the court could no longer view her actions as inadvertent or benign, that the weight of the evidence compelled a decisive ruling, and as he pronounced the final decision, one that stripped Nikki of the authority she had fought so hard to maintain and imposed consequences she never imagined facing alone, her world seemed to shatter in slow motion, the sound of the gavel echoing like a death knell through the courtroom, and for a brief, surreal moment, Nikki couldn't process what had happened, couldn't reconcile the woman she believed herself to be with the one the court had just condemned, her mind flashing back to the years she stood beside Victor, weathering scandals, battles, and betrayals together, believing they were unbreakable. And now, as she finally turned to look at him, she saw not rage but something far worse, disappointment, cold and profound, etched into his features, and that realization cut deeper than any legal ruling ever could, Because Nikki understood then that the judge's decision had done more than alter her legal standing. It had exposed a fracture in the foundation of her life, one that no amount of power, money, or love could easily repair. And as the courtroom began to stir, voices rising, reporters scrambling, and attorneys exchanging urgent whispers, Nikki remained frozen in her seat, stunned, humiliated, and utterly alone, the weight of the evidence and the finality of the decision crashing down upon her as she realized that in Genoa City, secrets always surface, and when they do, they demand a price, and this time the cost was everything Nikki Newman thought she had secured forever. In the moments that followed the judge's ruling, time itself seemed to distort for Nikki Newman, stretching and compressing all at once as the once familiar sounds of the courtroom, shuffling feet, clicking cameras, hushed voices, blurred into an indistinct roar that echoed inside her head, because the finality of the decision had not merely ended a case, it had cracked open a reality she was no longer prepared to face, and as she finally stood on unsteady legs, her hand instinctively reaching for the table as though it were the last solid thing tethering her to the ground, she felt eyes on her from every direction, eyes filled with judgment, curiosity, and satisfaction, and it dawned on her with crushing clarity that this was how it ended. Not with a dramatic defense, not with Victor swooping in to reclaim control, but with silence, humiliation, and the irrevocable understanding that the truth had slipped beyond her grasp. Victor rose moments later, adjusting his jacket with mechanical precision, and though he did not look at her, his presence loomed like a storm cloud heavy with unspoken consequences, and Nikki's heart twisted painfully because she knew Victor Newman better than anyone else alive, knew that his silence was never accidental, it was deliberate, a calculated pause before the reckoning, and as attorneys rushed toward him, whispering strategy and damage control, Nikki was left standing alone, the woman who once ruled the Newman mansion now reduced to an afterthought in a room that had once bent to her will. When they finally stepped outside into the harsh glare of cameras and microphones, the winter air biting against her skin, Nikki flinched at the barrage of shouted questions. Did you betray Victor? Did you lie under oath? Is this the end of the Newmans? Each one slicing into her like a blade, and though she tried to maintain the composure she had perfected over decades of public scrutiny, her voice failed her, the carefully rehearsed responses evaporating as she realized there was nothing left to spin, no narrative left to control, because the judge's decision had rewritten her story in permanent ink. Victor moved swiftly, his security team forming a barrier between him and the press, and for a fleeting, agonizing second Nikki thought he might turn back, might reach for her hand, might present the united front they had relied upon through countless scandals, but he didn't, and that absence spoke louder than any shouted accusation ever could, because Nikki understood then that the courtroom had not only stripped her of authority, it had stripped her of Victor's unquestioned trust, and that loss threatened to hollow her out from the inside. Back at the Newman mansion, the silence was even more oppressive, the grandeur of the space mocking her as she wandered through rooms filled with memories of triumph and resilience, her reflection in the mirrored walls unfamiliar, fractured, a woman caught between who she had been and who she was now becoming, and when Victor finally returned hours later, his entrance was devoid of drama, no raised voices, no immediate confrontation, just the quiet, ominous closing of the door that signaled the beginning of a far more personal trial. They stood facing each other in the living room, the distance between them charged with decades of love, betrayal, and shared ambition, and when Victor finally spoke, his voice low and controlled, asking her one simple question. Why? Nikki felt tears well despite her determination to remain strong, because that question held everything. The hurt, the disbelief, the unraveling of a partnership built on the belief that they were always on the same side, and as she tried to explain, to articulate the fear and desperation that had driven her decisions, she realized how fragile her justifications sounded outside the protective echo chamber of her own mind, how self-serving they appeared when stripped of emotion, and Victor listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, which terrified her more than anger ever could, because Nikki knew that Victor Newman's greatest weapon was patience, and when he finally responded, his words landed with brutal precision, telling her that the court's decision was not the end, but the beginning, that consequences would ripple outward through the family, the business, and their marriage, and that trust, once broken at this level, could not simply be demanded back. Elsewhere in Genoa City, the fallout spread rapidly, whispers turning into headlines as allies distanced themselves and rivals seized the opportunity. Jack Abbott watching the developments with a mixture of vindication and unease, knowing that while Nikki's downfall weakened Victor, it also destabilized the fragile balance of power that kept the city from descending into chaos. And as Nikki's children struggled to process the news, torn between loyalty to their mother and the undeniable weight of the evidence, Nikki found herself confronting a loneliness she had not felt in years, a realization that she could no longer shield her family from the consequences of her actions, no matter how noble she believed her intentions had been. Sleepless nights followed, each one haunted by the judge's words, Victor's silence, and the gnawing fear that the woman she had been fighting to protect no longer existed, replaced by someone the world now saw as calculating and dishonest. And as Nikki stared out over the grounds of the Newman estate, the future stretching before her uncertain and unforgiving, she understood that the ruling had forced a reckoning she could no longer avoid, one that would demand accountability, resilience, and perhaps a reinvention she was not yet sure she could survive, because in Genoa City, redemption was never guaranteed, power was fleeting, and the truth, once revealed, never stopped demanding its due. As dawn crept slowly over Genoa City, casting pale light across the Newman estate, Nikki Newman found herself awake yet again, seated alone in the quiet living room where the echoes of Victor's footsteps from the night before still seemed to linger, because sleep had become impossible now that the carefully constructed life she once inhabited had been dismantled piece by piece, and every ticking second reminded her that the judge's ruling was no longer an abstract threat but a permanent fracture that reshaped her future, her marriage, and her legacy. The silence was broken only by the distant hum of the city waking up, and as Nikki wrapped her arms around herself, she was forced to confront a truth more painful than any courtroom accusation, that she had underestimated the cost of control, believing she could manage outcomes, protect people she loved, and still emerge untouched. Yet now the consequences loomed large and unavoidable, and nowhere was that more evident than in Victor's continued absence, because despite being under the same roof, they now existed in separate emotional worlds, divided by disappointment, suspicion, and a chasm that words alone could not bridge. When Victor finally entered the room later that morning, his presence was commanding yet restrained, his expression carefully neutral, and Nikki's heart clenched as she realized that the man who once defended her against every external threat was now assessing her as he would any adversary, measuring damage, calculating risk, and determining how or if trust could ever be rebuilt. And when he spoke, his tone carried no accusation, only a chilling clarity as he explained that the ruling had triggered a chain reaction within Newman Enterprises, prompting board members to question leadership, allies to hesitate, and enemies to circle like sharks sensing blood in the water. And Nikki felt a surge of guilt so sharp it nearly brought her to her knees, because the empire she had sworn to protect was now vulnerable because of her actions. As the day unfolded, Nikki was forced into meetings she never imagined attending from such a diminished position, her voice softer, her authority questioned, and though some offered sympathy, others barely concealed their satisfaction, a reminder that in Genoa City loyalty was conditional and power fleeting, and with each interaction, Nikki felt the weight of her isolation grow heavier, realizing that even her children were struggling to reconcile the mother they loved with the woman the evidence had exposed, their concern laced with confusion and unspoken doubt, and that realization hurt more than any public humiliation ever could. Meanwhile, Victor began moving pieces behind the scenes, not to destroy Nikki but to contain the damage, a distinction that spoke volumes about the complexity of his feelings, because while he was furious at the betrayal, he was equally determined not to allow the fallout to destroy everything they had built. Yet Nikki could sense the emotional distance growing between them, each calculated decision reinforcing the reality that their relationship had shifted from partnership to uncertainty. Across town, Jack Abbott weighed his next move carefully, aware that Nikki's downfall had altered the landscape in ways that could either reignite old rivalries or open unexpected paths toward resolution. And as whispers spread through society events, boardrooms, and back-channel conversations, Nikki became a cautionary tale, her name invoked as proof that even the most powerful figures were not immune to consequence, and that knowledge haunted her as she retreated further inward, grappling with regret, anger, and the lingering question of whether redemption was still possible. One evening, standing once more in the dimly lit living room, Nikki finally confronted Victor with a raw honesty she had long avoided, admitting that fear, not ambition, had driven her decisions, fear of losing him, fear of losing control, fear of becoming irrelevant in a world that rewarded ruthlessness over vulnerability. And though Victor did not immediately respond, the silence between them shifted, heavy yet no longer impenetrable, suggesting that while forgiveness remained distant, understanding might still be within reach. As days turned into weeks, Nikki began the slow, painful process of rebuilding, not her public image, but her sense of self, accepting that the woman she had been before the ruling could not exist again, and that survival now required humility, accountability, and a willingness to face consequences without deflection. And as she looked out over Genoa City once more, the skyline both familiar and foreign, she understood that the judge's decision had not ended her story but forced it onto a far more treacherous path, one where every step mattered, every choice carried weight, and where redemption, if it came at all, would have to be earned not through power or secrecy, but through truth, resilience, and the courage to stand alone in a city that never forgot, and rarely forgave. As the weeks continued to unfold in the aftermath of the ruling, Nikki Newman discovered that the most brutal consequences were not delivered in courtrooms or splashed across headlines but whispered in pauses, sidelong glances, and conversations that stopped the moment she entered the room, because Genoa City had always thrived on perception, and now perception had turned sharply against her, reshaping her from respected matriarch into a cautionary symbol of overreach and secrecy, and each day forced her to confront the reality that reputation, once fractured, never shattered cleanly but splintered endlessly, cutting in unexpected places. Victor, meanwhile, intensified his efforts to stabilize Newman Enterprises, calling emergency board meetings, tightening internal controls, and reasserting dominance with the ruthless efficiency that had made him a legend. Yet Nikki could see the toll it took on him in the quiet moments, the way his shoulders sagged when no one was watching, the way his voice hardened whenever her name was mentioned in business contexts, because while he would not publicly condemn her, he also refused to shield her from consequences, a boundary that felt colder than outright rejection. And when Nikki finally confronted him about it late one evening, her voice breaking as she asked whether he still believed in her at all, Victor's response was devastating in its honesty, admitting that belief and trust were no longer the same thing, and that while he believed she loved him, he no longer trusted the choices she made when fear took hold, words that echoed in Nikki's mind long after the conversation ended. The ripple effects reached their children in different ways, with some clinging fiercely to Nikki, insisting that context mattered and that her intention should not be erased by legal language, while others struggled with anger and disappointment, questioning how the woman who preached integrity and loyalty could have crossed lines so deliberately, and Nikki bore their reactions in silence, refusing to defend herself with excuses, because deep down she knew that accountability, however painful, was the only path left to her. Outside the Newman orbit, Genoa City's power players recalibrated, alliances shifting subtly as Jack Abbott weighed whether to exploit Victor's distraction or extend an olive branch that could reshape their rivalry entirely. And as Nikki became aware of these maneuvers, she felt a sharp pang of irony, realizing that the very game she once played with confidence now unfolded beyond her control, reinforcing the humbling truth that influence, once lost, was not easily reclaimed. Nights became her greatest challenge, as insomnia dragged her through memories she could no longer outrun, moments when she had convinced herself that secrecy was strength, that withholding truth was a form of protection, and that Victor's empire required her to be ruthless in ways that contradicted her own moral compass. And as she replayed those decisions, Nikki began to understand how gradually she had drifted from the woman she once was, not through malice but through compromise after compromise, each one justified until justification became habit. One afternoon, summoned unexpectedly to testify in a related civil proceeding, Nikki faced the courtroom again, this time without illusion or defense, and as she answered questions with unflinching honesty, admitting her role without minimization, she felt a strange, painful clarity take hold, because for the first time since the ruling, she was no longer fighting the truth, and while the experience left her emotionally drained, it also planted the first fragile seed of self-respect she had felt in weeks. Victor watched from a distance, his expression unreadable, yet something shifted between them that evening when he acknowledged her testimony with a quiet nod rather than criticism, a small gesture that carried more weight than any grand declaration, suggesting that while forgiveness remained uncertain, respect might still be possible. As winter deepened, Nikki began carving out a new routine, stepping away from boardrooms and charity galas, focusing instead on rebuilding trust with her children and reclaiming a sense of purpose untainted by power struggles. And though the world continued to judge her harshly, She found solace in the discipline of accountability, learning that redemption, if it ever arrived, would do so gradually, through consistency rather than spectacle. Yet Genoa City was never content to let wounds heal quietly, and just as Nikki began to steady herself, new revelations threatened to surface, questions about who had leaked the final evidence to the court, whispers of ulterior motives, and the possibility that Nikki had been both architect and pawn in a larger game, forcing her to confront the unsettling idea that her downfall may have served someone else's agenda. And as she shared this suspicion with Victor, their conversation crackled with unresolved tension and cautious cooperation, hinting that while their marriage remained fractured, their instincts as survivors were far from extinguished. Standing together on the terrace one cold evening, overlooking the city that had both crowned and condemned them, Nikki realized that the judge's decision had not simply punished her, it had stripped away illusion, exposing the fragile line between control and collapse, love and power, loyalty and fear. And as Victor quietly reminded her that Genoa City respected strength born of truth more than dominance built on secrecy, Nikki understood that her journey forward would be defined not by reclaiming what she had lost, but by choosing, again and again, to face the consequences of who she had been while daring to become someone worthy of a second chance in a city that never forgot, never forgave easily, and always demanded its pound of flesh.